Oh, well, look, thank you very much, Leanne. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. And I have to point out there's been at least a 95% reduction in Gaza protesters since last time I spoke here, if you were here for the last one. And I believe that's a sign of an economic recovery. If those guys can get jobs, anyone can. I want to also acknowledge Laura, one of my fellow members of Parliament, and also Grania Moss, Chief Executive of the Regulation Ministry, and probably the only Chief Executive in the government who has a serious track record of private sector leadership, having been the Chief Executive of Bupa for 7 years. And I think that is something that's been missing from government. In the 80s, the government tried to set up the public service arm's length from politics and inadvertently created a priesthood that was arm's length from the people. The fact that we have a chief executive who has run a serious business, been the victim rather than the villain in the regulatory story, I think is an enormously positive thing. So it's good to see you here, Grania, engaging with people in business as you have many times. Now I want to start by saying something that I say just about every time I come here, and I appreciate Leanne's forbearance, but I think that we need to celebrate business more in this country. You know, too often you see a business making a profit and people jump to the conclusion that someone, somewhere, must be losing. And that is a dangerously false conclusion. There's a person who will engage as an entrepreneur, an investor, a worker, or a customer, but that person will only do it if doing so will make them better off than they otherwise would have been. And that's why business is not exploitative, it's not sinister, it's not deceptive. It's actually very simple. 4 types of people come together to achieve what they could not achieve alone. There's entrepreneurs who ask others to bring their ideas and dreams to life in the tangible world. There's investors who risk their savings in the hope of greater returns than they could achieve if they were to leave their money in the bank alone. There's workers who will exchange their time and talents for money to buy the things that they would like. And those workers become the 4th type of person, customers, who give up their money to buy things that they could not produce themselves. But the best thing about all of this, as I say, is that it's voluntary. Nobody's forced to do any of it. Business is actually adults freely cooperating, trading value for value to get stronger together. It's actually not only a force for good, it's one of the most beautiful things that happens in our community. And I don't think we celebrate that nearly enough. I think the most important thing that those of us who believe in business, as I do, can do for it, is ensure that New Zealand has a sound and predictable policy environment. And today I'd like to talk not just about what the government is doing to make it easier to do business. I hope that you'll agree our deregulation program is comprehensive and coherent. But most of all, I hope that there'll be people here who can say they genuinely are, 16 months into the government, feeling the effects of deregulation on their day-to-day business so they can spend less time on compliance activity and more time on productive activity. However, there's something more, and I appreciate your forbearance. It's not just what we're doing, but it's a why. Because I believe too often in the last 4 decades, there's people who favour open markets, we favour entrepreneurship, and we have won the technical argument, but we've lost in this country and across the West, we've lost the cultural argument. Yes, business is a force for good. Yes, our prosperity depends on unleashing the creative powers of a skilled and educated population. And yes, free markets and freedom generally are the way to do that. And I don't think there's anyone serious who disputes that. We now have decades of data from hundreds of countries showing that free markets lead to healthier, wealthier lives. These things are not really in dispute. The people that dispute them are either from the Flat Earth Society or the Green Party. However, when I hear the political reporting You know, when I hear most of Parliament, I know that we still have a long way to go winning the cultural argument around the case for business. And that's why I start every speech by just saying we actually need to celebrate business more. And I think one way we can start to win that cultural argument is discovering our true national identity, which for me has always been that we're a nation of pioneers. Our pioneering spirit brought our ancestors to this shore, and in some cases, in this room, brought the people themselves to these shores in search of something better. You know, we're a nation that was built by those who chose challenge over comfort. We have ancestors who crossed the globe not to be given something, but actually to be given the freedom to build something. And to this day, people who cross the seas don't ask for guarantees. No, they show up at Auckland International or Christchurch International asking for a fair go. They don't seek safety above all else. They're seeking opportunity. That is a big part of what our country is about and why people come here. And these people aren't waiting for permission. You know, they actually just want to get on with building a life for themselves and their families. And we can tell that story about practically every person who has paddled up or sailed up or landed on these islands. And just it was the same for my ancestors 800 years ago, some of whom arrived in Waka. And it's the same for New Zealanders arriving at those international terminals today. You know, this is a country at the frontier of the world, and it's for people seeking freedom, and it's a country for people who want that mentality. I don't think we celebrate that nearly enough. You know, even the treaty debate, which some people like to cast as a distraction, is really a simple question of what defines your life and your future. Is it events that happened perhaps centuries before you were born? Or is it the things that you will choose to do in the time that you have? Now, if you have an answer to that basic question between predetermination and self-determination, practically every other political question will fall into place. The problem we have is that somewhere along the line, we've seen more people choose the first options. Our futures were determined long ago. We have a culture that hesitates, and instead of cheering on success, we too often eye it suspiciously. Our instincts that we cultivated over decades seems to be increasingly caution over courage and conformity over creativity. I'll just give you one little example. Now, I doubt that many people in this room will be aware that last week Zuru, a New Zealand-founded firm, was awarded the Total Consumable Supplier of the Year award by Walmart. Now, some people know. Now, it's difficult to overstate how big that is. I mean, Walmart is still one of the top 10 biggest firms in the world. They sell stuff. And a New Zealand firm was just awarded their top supplier. Astonishing stuff. And they put out a press release. They retained a PR firm. And as far as I'm aware, not a single New Zealand media outlet has reported this triumph. However, if you are a regular reader of the New Zealand Herald, you will know that one of Zuru's owners, Anna Mowbray's ongoing quest to build a helipad in Westmere, Auckland, is clickbait from wall to wall. I mean, you can find out every detail of this ongoing resource consent. And to me, that is a classic example of how this country is very quick to cut people down, but very slow to celebrate their successes. And I look at our tax rates. We've gone since the neoliberal days of Helen Clark and Michael Cullen. We've gone from just 2 income tax rates to 5. And so we tell kids on the one hand, study hard, save and invest, but if it all works out and you get a good degree and you earn good money and you save it and you invest it carefully, then we will make sure that every step of the way we whack you a little bit harder just to make sure that you don't think success is something that you should be too happy about. And if you look at our migrant flows, yes, our tradition of people coming to these shores for opportunity, it continues, no question about that. But then you ask yourself, well, why do we also have one of the biggest diasporas? It's an ongoing exchange and flow. And I believe that the reason why so many come here seeking hope but give up and move on lies in a deep tension in our national character. And it's not new. None of this is new, but I believe it is getting sharper. There are two, I believe, invisible and yet powerful tribes that shape New Zealand's future. On the one side, we have the doers, the pioneers. I call them change makers. A lot of people that I've just spoken to out there are actually in this room. On the other hand, these are people who see the freedom to act. It's not a privilege, but it's a responsibility. Now, I did a minor social experiment to draw out this distinction earlier this year, although not everyone realised it at the time. The change makers saw me driving the Land Rover up Parliament steps for exactly what it was. No rules were broken, nobody was hurt. The only person that was in any danger was the security guard who ran in front of the thing and actually put himself in danger while supposedly upholding security. And we raised tens of thousands of dollars for a guy at Auckland Medical School who is creating living heart valves that grow with small children so that they're not subject to multiple operations throughout their childhood to put in progressively larger valves as their heart grows. It's some of the coolest stuff I've heard about all year, and it's happening right here in New Zealand. It's very cool stuff. However, no good deed goes unpunished. As I rapidly found out leading the news for 3 nights in a row. There are endless whinges, and the main thing they said is, I should have asked permission. Now, the interesting thing about this is most of them didn't seem to know who I should have asked permission. They were just certain that anyone that does anything should ask permission of somebody, and if you can't find someone, maybe you should make them up. It's a depressing and defeated way to live, but I thought it brought out nicely the two tribes in New Zealand. I was talking to one journalist who had been drinking with some farmers up north, and their only issue was that it should have gone all the way to the top, and they're considering not voting for me because I didn't succeed. For the most part, though, it showed the real difference in attitude and culture. And so I look at the way that most people, well, at least the people I like to side with, think. If you're someone who puts everything on the line, you start a business, you employ others, you keep going when the odds are against you, and anyone that's run a business through a few cycles knows just how tough that can be. You work hard, you employ others, you build community, but underneath all of that is a belief that life is what you make it. And too often, I believe, in our culture, we punish that. And so this is the why. I'm going to talk about the deregulation, but why? If you're taxed harder, you're regulated more tightly, and you're lectured more condescendingly. If you're told that success is a problem and ambition is selfish, that your values are outdated, and yet the country and most of the things that people enjoy and wouldn't fund wouldn't work with it. Well, those are the people that I like to stand for, to represent. We are here for people who believe in letting you make a difference in your own life rather than telling you how to live it. The problem is that other part of New Zealand, its influence, it grows, and I call it a majority for mediocrity. These are the people who would love nothing more than to go back into lockdown and make sourdough again. And you'd be surprised. You actually poll people, even towards the end of COVID, there were many people who just wished that maybe we could go back into lockdown. And they blame one of the most successful societies in history for the problems that they have in their own lives. They believe that ancestry is destiny, and they believe that people are responsible for things that may have happened centuries before they were born, yet often it's the same people who would like to absolve criminals of crimes that they committed just last week. And far from believing that people can make a difference in their own lives, they actually then go one step further and say the problems they have are directly caused by other people's success. And they look for politicians whose fundamental message is, young New Zealanders, if you study hard, get good grades and get a job and save money, invest wisely, we'll tax you harder and better than that. But we'll actually take money off people that have succeeded with new taxes to solve your problem, because their success is the cause of your problem and our redistribution is your solution. It's not about any one group or party, although I could name a few. It's this mindset. It's a creeping belief that life should be comfortable, not challenging, that fairness means flattering everyone to the same level rather than lifting people up, and that success is there to be questioned rather than admired. They see every problem through the lens of blame. They see society's gains as someone else's loss. They want safety without sacrifice, reward without risk, rights without responsibility, and they speak the language of resentment, not aspiration. They vote for politicians who promise comfort today, but at the cost of opportunity tomorrow. Now, this toxic mix of personal disappointment and ideological resentment, it's being used to manufacture, in my view, a new generation of mediocrity voters. Disillusioned, they're angry, they're ready to believe that someone else is to blame. And too often, that's exactly what too many politicians have done. And you look at the scapegoating that goes on. You know, farmers are blamed for emissions, even though there is a clear case that methane has a different profile. Law-abiding firearm owners are blamed for the country's most heinous crime, even though they have nothing to do with it. Landlords are blamed for housing shortages, even though landlords are quite heroically trying to solve housing shortages. And employers are blamed for low wages, even though every employer in this room knows that you compete hard to attract and retain the best people, and if you could pay more, you would. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of how labour markets work. And they've blamed successful businesses for prices being too high, even though those businesses, and I'm talking about supermarkets, for example, and the many people who run supermarkets in this country, working up from a Foursquare to a New World, they're blamed for prices for being too high, even though there are so many better and more cogent explanations for where costs are generated through the entire food supply chain for groceries. Now, this is the kind of lazy politics of envy and distraction that actually leads us nowhere. And the danger is, with this tall poppy scapegoating politics, that each side of politics has its own scapegoats, and they change depending on who's in government. But the underlying tension, where we pull down more than we push up, endures. And that, I believe, is toxic to the success of the country. But the good news is it's not inevitable. I believe as interest rates come down in the short term, with inflation brought to heel, and albeit there is some uncertainty in the global environment, we have at least a government that is no longer borrowing recklessly, is cutting red tape and restoring sanity to regulation, and also pulling us back from the brink of identity politics. And if you look at our deregulatory effort, as a government, what we're seeking to do is allow people to be empowered and enabled to do things on their own judgment, so long as they're not directly harming others, not unlike my Land Rover driving. We're fixing the CCCFA so that it's there to protect consumers rather than punish borrowers and turn your mortgage broker into a marriage counsellor, because that has not contributed to financial literacy. It is one of those things that's contributed to spending more time on compliance, less time being productive. We've legalised granny flats, because why should you have to fight a council to build a building less than 70 metres, signed off by proper tradespeople, that doesn't actually affect anyone else? We're rewriting early childhood education regulations, because this has been one of the most grotesquely and hilariously over-regulated sectors. And yet it's a $6 billion industry vital to the future of our society. Thanks to the Ministry for Regulation, we're now turning the regulations upside down, so only the bits that focus on the children's safety and the quality of learning are actually regulated, rather than the myriad other things that make people's life a nightmare. We're reviewing health and safety laws. In my view, and I'm biased, but every small business in New Zealand should have a small picture of Brooke van Velden up in their lunchroom for what she's done for the health and safety legislation, what she's doing for the Holidays Act. Those two things alone, before you talk about minimum wage laws and the changes to labour laws, right across the board, Brooke is making it easier for one Kiwi to offer another Kiwi a job and do it sustainably without tying up a huge amount of your time and effort elsewhere. if you look at the pathways for agricultural and horticultural products, I was talking to someone just now who is selling in South Canterbury. You know, it takes 5 years to get new products that are used in other countries into New Zealand. Again, just like ECE, we're turning that upside down and rewriting it so that New Zealand Ag and New Zealand Hort can have the best products in the world right now, not 5 years after other countries' agricultural farmers and horticultural growers get them. The hairdressing and barbering industry, you know, has terrible rules that are barely enforced but make no difference. And yet we still bear the cost of having a 40-year-old regulatory regime that is completely out of date. We're just getting rid of it. It's the right thing to do. And perhaps the biggest of the lot is the Resource Management Act. I believe is the single biggest handbrake on building infrastructure, building homes at the end of that infrastructure, and just generally building the settler society, great lives in one of the best places on earth. Why can't young New Zealanders afford homes? Resource management. Why are power bills so high? Hard to get a consent for transmission and generation. Why can't I buy McDonald's in Wanaka? Resource Management Act. And a whole lot of whinges from the so-called public health profession. You know, each question has that same answer. And if we want more high-paying jobs and affordable housing, we want Kiwis to have confidence to actually stay in this country long term, then I'm really proud of the role that ACT and Simon Court have played setting up the framework for the Resource Management Act reforms based on property rights. You know, we put that out as a discussion document in 2022. Not often that a discussion document leads to real change, but a property rights-based resource management law is a really good example of that. There's also the Regulatory Standards Bill, which is something that I'm enormously proud of, and I believe in the long term is going to make a massive difference to the role of business and ultimately the attitude towards tall poppy of this society. We have, over the years, improved the way that our country looks at the rights of citizens vis-a-vis the state. Once upon a time, Muldoon used to just come along and then he'd run the printing presses, borrow billions until the election came. Then he'd have 3 years to get over the hangover, and then he'd pump it up again and get re-elected. Now, our society responded to that in a number of ways. The Constitution Act, the Reserve Bank Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. You know, we managed to make transparent for voters when politicians were trying to screw the scrum. And I think that was an enormously positive thing. It took us from being a sort of a tween to maybe a teenage country constitutionally. That would be a great development. However, then we put in place the Bill of Rights so that voters could actually see, well, not many laws get a Section 7 report that's hostile, but if I hear that some politician's doing something that violates the Bill of Rights, maybe I ought to pay attention. All of this has been designed to increase the political cost of screwing the scrum and making it harder for people to get by and do their business. And as a result, we have a much better business environment than we had 40 years ago. I believe it's unquestionably true. But if I was to try and put my finger on what's gone wrong in the last 40 years, we've certainly, at a macro level, got a much better setup. But at a micro level, the amount of time that people spend dealing with crazy little regulatory things all over the show has only got worse. There are more rules, more brittly enforced, that make life harder for people that just want to get on with it. And this, for me, is the manifestation of everything that's wrong with our culture. There's always someone wagging their finger saying no, making it harder to do business. The Regulatory Standards Act is part of ACT's, it's a 20-year project, and it's very close to being introduced to Parliament for the first time to be successfully passed this year. It sets out what the principles that New Zealanders should expect their government to follow, that the government shouldn't take away your liberties or your property rights unless it's doing so to defend someone else's and it's compensating you, that the government should ensure that decision making is not arbitrarily made by some bureaucrat but made according to the rule of law with a proper role of courts, that if the government is going to make a law that restricts your freedoms, it better have explained why there's no other solution except for a government regulation, why the benefits of this government regulation exceed the costs, and why, having examined other possibilities like self-regulation, for example, it really feels this needs to be done. Now, if we put in place this kind of expectation up in lights alongside the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the Reserve Bank Act, the Constitution Act, the Bill of Rights, then we start to build a sense that people doing business in this country do actually have some rights, that it's legitimate to want to use and exchange your property, which all business really is, and that that's something that we as a country would like to defend. I think if we can put that in place, and we will this term of government, then we will have made massive progress away from the tall poppy chopping dark underbelly of our country towards having a truly free society where the underlying values are the same as brought the pioneers to our country in the first place. And I believe not only that, but we'll have a much more respectful society that is a much better place to bring up kids in a prosperous way. It really leaves us with a choice between two futures. One where ambition is met with suspicion and success is something to be taxed and tamed, or one where we cut back red tape and back the people who take risks, work hard and create something better, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Now, I know which one I stand for. And that's what the government's deregulation agenda is striving for, not to control, but to clear the way. That's why we're rebuilding a culture of responsibility, not one of resentment, and one where every person is treated not as part of a group, but as a thinking and valuing being with potential. Now, we can't change in this country our size or our remoteness. We can't change our underlying history or culture, and we can't quickly change our level of education, although we should do it as quickly as possible. What we can do is change our policies. That's the drive to reduce waste, to get more money from overseas investment, to put the Regulatory Standards Bill in place, to replace the Resource Management Act, to simplify anti-money laundering laws, to open more charter schools, build more roads, and generally open up pathways to opportunity in this country. As Norman Kirk, one of my favourite Labour Prime Ministers, once said, people everywhere need someone to love, somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and something to hope for. And it's still good advice over 50 years on for any country. I believe people are leaving because they feel let down. They've done their homework, got the grades, and worked hard and saved money, and yet life remains harder here than it could be elsewhere. Ambitious people are being told that success is not something to celebrate, and that is what we need to change. I believe that the way we regulate, the rules we put in place to prevent or encourage other people are at the heart of the legislative expression of our culture. And if we're going to win the culture war that really matters, which is nothing to do with pronouns or bathrooms or anything like that, but are we a people who seek and celebrate success and push people up, or a culture that pulls people down? If we make the real culture war our focus for victory and success, then for every New Zealander who's taken a chance, whether it was to paddle or sail here generations ago, or step off a plane just this morning, taking out a loan to start a business, taking on your first employee from a small business becoming a slightly less small one, building a home or seeking a resource consent, whatever it is that you seek to do, we need to make this country a place that is a tribute to and a host for human action. If we can do that, then I think people genuinely will believe that this is a country which has its best days still ahead of it. So I thank you very much for listening. And the part I'm really looking forward to is hearing your questions, because at the end of the day, you guys are all in business, so are me, so am I. I'm in the representation business. And that's the business of hearing the hopes and concerns of people paying the bill, and hopefully aligning the direction of the country through government with those hopes and concerns. So